One choice, one moment, one love story. Welcome to When He Chose Her. Enjoy the story. Translate this, and I'll wire you $10 million right now. Ethan Caldwell said, his voice smooth with amusement, the kind of amusement that came from never being told no, the kind that made people laugh even when the joke wasn't funny, the kind that filled a room before he even finished the sentence, and around him the private dining room of Levant Steakhouse shimmered under warm amber lights. Crystal glasses catching reflections of power and money and quiet competition, and across the table a few investors chuckled politely, one of them leaning back with a grin as if the outcome was already decided, as if the girl standing beside the table was just another passing detail in a night designed for deals, not surprises, and Lily Harper stood there with her order pad in hand, still, composed, her uniform simple, her hair tied back in a way that revealed nothing and everything at once, and she didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. She just looked at the paper Ethan slid across the table, a single sheet printed with tight lines of unfamiliar script, something that looked complex enough to impress, but simple enough to mock. And for a brief second the room expected hesitation, maybe embarrassment, maybe a polite apology followed by a quiet retreat, because that was the pattern. That was the script everyone knew. But Lily's fingers touched the edge of the page with a calm that didn't belong to the moment, and her eyes moved once, twice, steady, like she wasn't reading it for the first time but remembering something she had known long ago. And Ethan watched her with half a smile, tapping his watch lightly against the table as if timing how long it would take before she admitted defeat, and someone at the far end whispered, "This should be good," under their breath, and another added, 10 million says she can't even tell what language that is. And the air carried that soft layer of arrogance that comes from too much certainty, too much comfort, too much distance from real consequences. But Lily didn't react to any of it. Not the voices, not the laughter, not even the weight of the number he had thrown out like it meant nothing, because to him it didn't, and that was the point. And then she lifted her gaze slightly, not fully meeting his eyes yet, just enough to shift the energy in the space by a fraction, and she said quietly, "Are you sure you want the truth?" And it wasn't defiance, it wasn't attitude, it was something else, something steady, something that didn't ask for permission but offered a choice. And for the first time Ethan's smile paused, just for a second, like a glitch in a system that wasn't used to resistance, and he leaned back, folding his arms, curiosity flickering behind his composed expression. "That depends," he said, his tone still light, but no longer careless, "on whether you can actually give it." And the room leaned in without realizing it, conversations at nearby tables fading into background noise as if the moment had pulled a quiet curtain around itself. And Lily nodded once, almost to herself, as if confirming something internally, and then she spoke, not fast, not slow, but with a clarity that landed like a precise note in a silent room, her voice soft yet unmistakably certain, translating line by line without hesitation, without searching, without stumbling, the unfamiliar script unfolding into English as naturally as if it had been written that way from the start. And at first the reactions were subtle, a raised eyebrow, a shifting posture, a glance exchanged between two men who had expected something very different. And then the subtle turned into stillness, and the stillness turned into something heavier, something closer to disbelief, because she didn't just translate, she understood, and there was a difference, and Ethan's fingers stopped tapping, his attention no longer casual but fixed, sharp, as if recalibrating in real time. And Lily's eyes moved back to the page one last time before she added, almost as an afterthought, "And the final clause, it changes everything." And she looked up now, fully meeting his gaze for the first time, her expression calm, unreadable. "It says you're agreeing to terms that would cost you far more than 10 million. And the words settled into the room like a quiet shockwave. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just a silence that expanded outward, swallowing the laughter that had filled the space seconds before, and somewhere a glass was set down a little too carefully. Someone exhaled without meaning to, and Ethan didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, because in that instant the game he thought he was playing had shifted into something else entirely, something he hadn't planned, something he hadn't controlled, and the waitress he hadn't looked at twice was no longer background, no longer invisible, no longer part of the scenery, and for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell wasn't the one in control of the room. And Lily Harper, still holding her notepad, still standing exactly where she had been, didn't need to say another word to make that clear. No one spoke for a full 3 seconds, and in a room where deals were usually measured in seconds and silence meant weakness, those 3 seconds felt longer than any negotiation Ethan Caldwell had ever sat through, and he slowly leaned forward, his eyes narrowing not in anger but in calculation, the kind of calculation that had built his fortune, the kind that searched for patterns, for tells, for anything that could explain what just happened. But Lily Harper did not move. She did not shift her weight. She did not look away. She simply stood there with the same quiet composure, as if the air around her had not just changed, as if $10 million had not just been casually dismissed in favor of something far more dangerous, the truth. And one of the investors cleared his throat, attempting to recover the rhythm of the evening. "That is a bold claim," he said, forcing a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Are you saying the entire contract is compromised?" And Lily turned her gaze slightly toward him, respectful but firm. "I am saying the final clause gives control of the asset under conditions that are deliberately misleading," she replied, her voice even. "It is written to appear conditional, but it is not." And another man leaned forward now, interest replacing amusement. "How can you be so sure?" he asked, and Lily's fingers lightly tapped the edge of the paper once, a small, precise motion. "Because the phrasing is not standard," she said. "It borrows from 3 different legal dialects, and only one of them actually applies to the jurisdiction listed." And the room shifted again, not with laughter this time, but with attention, focused, sharp, and Ethan reached for the paper himself, pulling it closer, scanning the lines that had seemed insignificant just minutes ago. And for the first time, he was not reading to confirm his own understanding. He was reading to test hers. And something in his expression changed, subtle but unmistakable, the faintest crease forming between his brows. And he looked up at her, not as a server, not as background, but as a variable he had not accounted for. "What language is this?" he asked, his tone quieter now, stripped of performance. And Lily answered without hesitation. "It is a hybrid," she said, "primarily Levantine Arabic, but with embedded legal phrasing influenced by French commercial law." And someone at the table let out a low whistle before catching himself, while another muttered, "That is not something you just pick up," under his breath. And Ethan held her gaze a second longer, then leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose, not frustrated, not impressed, but something in between, something closer to intrigued, and he glanced at his assistant, standing near the door. "Call legal," he said simply. "Have them review the final clause immediately." And the assistant nodded and stepped out without question, and the room remained suspended in that new reality, one where the assumptions had been quietly dismantled, and Lily finally lowered her eyes back to her notepad, as if the moment had passed, as if her role had returned to something smaller, something safer. "Would you like me to place your order now?" she asked, her tone returning to professional calm. And the contrast was almost disorienting, like watching a storm disappear into clear sky without warning. And one of the men blinked, almost laughing in disbelief. "You just potentially saved him hundreds of millions, and you are asking about dinner?" he said, and Lily offered a small, polite nod. "That is what I am here for," she replied, and Ethan's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but into something that acknowledged the moment. "Not anymore," he said quietly, almost to himself, and then louder, more direct. "What is your name?" And Lily hesitated for the briefest second, not out of fear but out of habit, as if names carried weight she preferred to avoid, and then she answered, "Lily Harper." And Ethan repeated it once, under his breath, as if testing how it fit. "Lily." And there was no mockery in it now, no casual dismissal, just recognition. And his phone buzzed on the table, a message from his legal team already coming through faster than usual. Because when Ethan Caldwell asked for something, systems moved, people responded, and he glanced at the screen, his eyes scanning quickly, and then he set the phone down without saying a word. But the silence that followed was different now, heavier, confirmed, and one of the investors leaned forward, unable to hold back. "Well?" he asked, and Ethan looked up, his gaze steady. "She is. Right?" he said simply, and that was all it took. The final shift, the moment where disbelief turned into acceptance. And Lily did not react, did not smile, did not claim anything. She simply stood there, the same as before, as if being right was not an event but a natural state. And Ethan studied her for a long second, longer than necessary, longer than polite, but not uncomfortable, just curious, deeply curious. And then he gestured slightly toward the empty chair at the edge of the table. "Sit," he said, not as an order, but as an invitation. 5 minutes. And Lily glanced at the chair, then at him, then back at her notepad, weighing something unseen, something internal. And for a moment it seemed like she might refuse, like she might step back into the safe distance she had maintained for so long. But instead she placed her pen down slowly, deliberately, and pulled the chair out just enough to sit, her posture straight, her expression unchanged, and the room, once again, adjusted around her, not because she demanded it, but because she did not need to. The chair made almost no sound as Lily Harper sat down, and yet the shift it created was louder than anything that had happened that night. Because people like Ethan Caldwell were not used to inviting waitresses into conversations that shaped markets, and people like Lily were not expected to accept. And for a brief moment the table seemed to reorganize itself around her presence, not physically, but in the way attention moved, in the way eyes recalibrated. And Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, studying her not with arrogance now, but with precision, the same precision he used when evaluating billion-dollar risks. And he slid the contract back toward the center, tapping once on the section she had referenced. "Explain it," he said, his voice lower, controlled, stripped of performance. And Lily glanced at the page, then at him, and for the first time there was the faintest hint of hesitation, not uncertainty, but awareness, as if she understood that stepping further into this conversation meant crossing a line she had carefully maintained for a long time. And then she exhaled quietly and began. "The clause appears to be conditional on delivery timelines," she said, her tone steady, "but the phrasing ties the condition to a secondary interpretation of liability that activates regardless of performance." And one of the investors frowned, leaning closer. "That does not make sense," he said, and Lily nodded slightly. "It is not meant to," she replied. "It is meant to look correct to someone who reads quickly." And a small ripple of reaction moved through the table, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to signal that something deeper was unfolding. And Ethan watched her carefully, not interrupting, not challenging, just listening, fully, which was rare, even for him. And Lily continued, her finger tracing a single line without touching the paper. "This section references a legal framework that does not apply to the jurisdiction listed, but it is written in a way that suggests it does," she said. "Which means if you sign it, you are agreeing to terms that can be enforced elsewhere under different rules." And the room went still again. But this time it was not surprise, it was understanding. The kind that arrives slowly and then all at once. And Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, and he leaned back, exhaling. "They tried to bury it," he said quietly, and Lily did not respond. She did not need to. And one of the men shook his head, almost impressed. "That is meticulous," he murmured, and another added, "and dangerous." And Ethan's gaze returned to Lily, sharper now, more focused. "Where did you learn this?" he asked, and the question hung in the air. Longer than expected, because it was not casual, it was direct, and Lily's eyes dropped briefly to the table, not avoiding, but choosing. And when she spoke, her voice was softer, but no less certain. "I studied languages," she said, and someone at the far end let out a quiet laugh, not mocking, but disbelieving. "That is more than languages," he said, and Lily's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile. "Languages are never just languages," she replied, and Ethan held her gaze, searching for something beneath the surface, something that explained the gap between who she appeared to be and what she clearly was. And for a moment it seemed like he might push further, ask more, dig deeper, but instead he shifted slightly, changing direction. "How many languages do you speak?" he asked, and Lily paused again, this time not because she did not know the answer, but because the answer did not feel necessary. "Enough," she said simply, and one of the investors chuckled softly. "That is not an answer," he said, and Lily looked at him calmly. "It is the only one that matters here," she replied, and the table fell quiet again, not out of tension, but out of a growing respect that no one had planned to feel, and Ethan's expression changed again, just slightly. The edge of something unfamiliar appearing in his eyes, something that looked a lot like admiration, though he would not have called it that, and his phone buzzed again, a follow-up message from legal confirming the implications in more technical terms, and he glanced at it briefly before setting it aside, uninterested in the validation now that he had already accepted it, and he looked back at Lily. "You saved me a very expensive mistake," he said, his tone measured, sincere, and Lily shook her head lightly. "You asked a question," she replied. "I answered it, and the simplicity of it landed harder than any compliment." And for a moment Ethan did not respond. He just watched her, as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the situation, about her, about the quiet spaces he had overlooked for years, and then he leaned back slightly, a decision forming behind his eyes, something deliberate, something that extended beyond the table, beyond the contract, beyond the night itself. And he said, "After your shift ends, I would like to continue this conversation." And Lily's expression did not change, but something in her stillness shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if the offer carried more weight than it appeared, and she picked up her pen again, returning it to her hand with practiced ease. "I have work to do," she said calmly, not accepting, not refusing, just stating a fact, and Ethan nodded once, not pressing, not insisting. "So do I," he replied, and for the first time that night, there was no challenge in his voice, no test, no game, just a quiet acknowledgement of something real that had just begun. The moment ended without applause, without acknowledgement, as if the room itself had agreed to pretend nothing extraordinary had just happened, and Lily Harper stood from the chair with the same quiet grace she had sat down with, picking up her notepad as though she had simply paused her shift for a moment rather than altered the course of a multi-million-dollar decision. And she gave a small nod toward the table, professional, neutral. "I will place your order now," she said, and before anyone could respond, she turned and walked away, her steps measured, steady, disappearing back into the rhythm of the restaurant as if she had never stepped outside of it at all. And for a few seconds no one at the table spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because none of them were quite sure how to say it. And Ethan Caldwell watched her go, his gaze following her across the room, past the polished wood, past the soft lighting, past the carefully orchestrated elegance that suddenly felt less important than the quiet figure moving through it. And one of the investors leaned back, shaking his head with a low exhale. "Where did you find her?" he asked, half joking, half serious, and Ethan did not answer, not immediately, because the question itself felt misplaced, as if it assumed Lily belonged to a category he could define, and he simply said, "I did not." And that was all. And the conversation around the table slowly restarted, but it had changed, the tone different now, less certain, more cautious, as if the presence of one unexpected variable had reminded them all that certainty was often an illusion. And Ethan's phone buzzed again, another message from his legal team, more details, more confirmation, but he barely glanced at it this time, because his attention had shifted, not to the contract, not to the deal, but to the person who had quietly unraveled both. And across the room Lily moved from table to table, her expression composed, her movements efficient, pouring water, taking orders, responding to questions with polite brevity. And if someone had walked in at that moment, they would have seen nothing unusual, just another waitress doing her job, just another night in a high-end restaurant. And that was what made it so disorienting, because Ethan now knew that what appeared ordinary was anything but, and he found himself watching the details he would normally ignore, the way she listened more than she spoke, the way she anticipated requests before they were made, the way her calm seemed unaffected by the chaos of the room. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar, not control, not dominance, but curiosity that he could not immediately satisfy. And it lingered, steady, persistent. And when Lily returned with the first course, placing plates with practiced precision, Ethan looked up at her again, not to test her, not to challenge her, but simply to understand. "You said the clause was deliberate," he said quietly, keeping his voice low enough that it did not disrupt the rest of the table. Do you think they expected it to go unnoticed? And Lily placed the final plate down before answering, her tone calm, measured. They expected it to be overlooked, she said. Not because it is hidden, but because most people do not read carefully when they believe they already understand. And Ethan nodded slightly, absorbing the words, not just for what they meant about the contract, but for what they implied about him. And there was no accusation in her voice, no judgment, just a statement, and that made it land harder in one of the investors glanced between them, a small smile forming. You should hire her, he said casually. At the very least, she would make your legal team nervous, and a few quiet chuckles followed, lighter this time, not dismissive, but appreciative, and Ethan did not smile, not yet. But there was a shift in his expression, something closer to agreement than amusement, and Lily did not react at all. She simply stepped back, giving the table space, her role returning to its original shape, and yet it no longer fit the same way. And as she moved away again, Ethan reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a sleek business card, turning it between his fingers for a moment as if considering something, weighing it. And then he set it down on the table, not pushing it toward anyone, not making a statement, just placing it there. And he looked up once more, catching Lily's attention as she passed by. And he did not call out, did not interrupt. He simply met her eyes for a brief second and then glanced down at the card, a silent gesture, subtle, deliberate, and Lily's gaze followed, just for a moment, taking in the card, the name, the number, the implication, and then she looked back at him, her expression unchanged, calm, unreadable, and she gave the smallest nod, not acceptance, not rejection, just acknowledgement, before continuing on, and Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, realizing that for the first time that night, he was not the one setting the pace, and strangely, he did not mind. By the time the main course was cleared, the energy at the table had shifted completely, no longer driven by ego or performance, but by a quieter, more deliberate focus. And yet Ethan Caldwell found himself only half present in the conversation, responding when necessary, nodding at the right moments. But his attention kept drifting, pulled again and again toward the same point across the room, where Lily Harper moved through her shift as if nothing had changed, as if she had not just dismantled a deal with a few calm sentences, and it unsettled him in a way he could not quite explain, not because he felt challenged, but because he felt seen in a way that bypassed his usual defenses. And that was rare, and when the check finally arrived, one of the investors leaned back with a satisfied sigh. Well, that was not the evening I expected, he said, glancing toward Ethan with a knowing look. But I suppose it was more valuable than most. And Ethan gave a small nod. Most things are, he replied, his tone thoughtful rather than dismissive. And as the others began to gather their belongings, exchanging handshakes and quiet remarks, the room slowly returned to its usual rhythm, conversations rising again, the soft hum of luxury settling back into place. But for Ethan, the night was not finished, not even close, and as the last of his guests stepped away, he remained seated for a moment longer, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, his gaze steady, fixed, on the direction Lily had disappeared. And then he stood, smoothing his jacket with a small, automatic motion, and picked up the business card he had placed earlier, turning it once before slipping it back into his pocket, as if reconsidering the method, not the intention. And across the restaurant, in a quieter corner near the service station, Lily stood with another waitress, exchanging a few brief words, her posture relaxed but attentive, and for a moment she allowed herself a small exhale, the kind that came at the end of a long shift, the kind that released tension without drawing attention, and her colleague leaned in slightly, whispering something that made Lily shake her head with a faint, almost amused expression. No, she said softly. It was just a conversation, and the other waitress raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, but before she could respond, Lily turned back toward the floor, her focus returning to the work in front of her, and that was when Ethan approached, not abruptly, not with the commanding presence he was known for, but with a measured pace that suggested intention rather than impulse. And he stopped a few feet away, not interrupting immediately, giving her the space to notice him on her own terms, and when she did, her eyes lifting to meet his, there was no surprise, no tension, just recognition, and he inclined his head slightly, a gesture that carried more respect than any words he could have chosen. "Are you finished for the night?" he asked, his voice calm. And Lily glanced briefly toward the dining room, then back at him. "Almost," she said, and there was a pause, not uncomfortable, just unfilled, and Ethan did not rush to fill it, did not push, did not assume. He simply waited, and that alone set him apart from every other person who had approached her that evening. And after a moment, Lily added, "Give me 10 minutes," and Ethan nodded once. "I will be outside," he replied, and with that, he stepped back, turning toward the exit without another word, leaving the choice entirely in her hands. And as the door closed behind him, the cool night air greeted him with a sharp contrast to the warmth of the restaurant. The city alive in its usual way, distant traffic, soft lights, the steady pulse of movement that never fully stopped. And he stood there for a moment, his hands in his pockets, looking up at the skyline as if recalibrating his thoughts. And for the first time that day, there was no urgency, no immediate decision waiting to be made, just a quiet anticipation of what might come next. And inside, Lily finished her final tasks with the same efficiency she had shown all evening, clearing the last table, checking her section, exchanging a few closing words with her manager, and when she finally untied her apron, folding it neatly before setting it aside, there was a subtle shift in her posture, as if she had stepped out of one role and into another. And she paused for a second, just a second, her eyes drifting toward the front door, toward the possibility waiting beyond it. And then she reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the edge of the business card she had quietly taken earlier, and she held it there, not pulling it out, not examining it, just acknowledging its presence. And after a brief breath, she walked toward the exit, pushing the door open into the cool night air, where Ethan Caldwell was still standing, exactly where he said he would be. And when he turned to face her, there was no trace of the man who had laughed earlier that evening, only someone who had begun to listen. The night air carried a quiet chill, the kind that made people slow down without realizing it. And Lily Harper stepped out onto the sidewalk, the door closing softly behind her, the sounds of the restaurant fading into a distant hum. And for a brief moment, she simply stood there, adjusting to the shift, from light to shadow, from noise to calm. And Ethan Caldwell turned toward her, his posture relaxed but attentive, as if he had been waiting not just for her arrival, but for the right moment to speak. And when he did, his voice was different, stripped of the edge it had carried earlier. "Thank you for coming," he said, and Lily tilted her head slightly, a subtle acknowledgement. "You said 10 minutes, she replied, her tone neutral, not warm, not distant, just present. And Ethan gave a faint nod, accepting the quiet precision of her response. And for a second neither of them spoke, the city filling the space between them with distant headlights and the soft rhythm of passing cars. And then he reached into his pocket, pulling out his business card again. But this time he did not offer it immediately. He simply held it, as if reconsidering the gesture, and instead he said, "What you did tonight, it was not just impressive." And he paused, searching for the right word, something that did not diminish what had happened. "It was rare," he finished, and Lily's gaze shifted slightly, not deflecting the compliment, but not accepting it either. "It was necessary," she said, and the simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any modesty could have. And Ethan let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. "You keep answering questions I did not ask," he said, and Lily's lips curved just slightly. "You keep asking questions you already know the answer to," she replied. And for the first time, Ethan smiled, not the practiced smile he used in boardrooms or negotiations, but something quieter, something genuine. And he looked at her for a moment, really looked, as if trying to understand the balance she carried so effortlessly. The intelligence that did not need to prove itself, the confidence that did not need to be loud. And then he shifted his weight slightly, his tone becoming more direct. "Come work for me," he said, not as a demand, not even as a proposal wrapped in persuasion, but as a straightforward offer. And Lily did not react immediately. She did not look surprised, did not ask questions. She simply held his gaze, and the silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional. And then she asked, "Doing what?" And Ethan's answer came without hesitation. "Advising," he said, interpreting, analyzing, seeing what others miss. And Lily glanced briefly down the street, her eyes following a passing car before returning to him. "You already have people for that," she said, and Ethan nodded. "I do," he admitted. "But none of them saw what you saw tonight." And there was no arrogance in his voice, no attempt to diminish his own team, just a clear acknowledgement of fact, and Lily considered that for a moment, her expression thoughtful, and then she said, "You are not looking for someone to translate." And Ethan's brow lifted slightly, intrigued. "No," he said, and Lily nodded once, as if confirming something she had already understood. "You are looking for someone who will tell you when you are wrong," she said, and the words landed between them with quiet precision, and Ethan did not deny it, did not soften it. He simply said, "Yes." And that honesty shifted something again, subtle but real, and Lily looked at him for a long second, not evaluating his offer, but evaluating him, the way he stood, the way he spoke, the way he listened. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but there was a deeper layer beneath it now, something more personal. "And what happens when I say no?" she asked, and Ethan did not hesitate. "Then you say no," he replied, "and I respect it." And there was no challenge in his tone, no hidden pressure, just a simple statement. And Lily held his gaze, searching for something that was not there, something she had likely encountered before: expectation, entitlement, assumption. But she found none of it, and for a brief moment, the space between them felt balanced, equal, and that was new. And she reached into her pocket slowly, pulling out the business card he had given her earlier, holding it between her fingers, turning it once as if feeling its weight. And then she looked back at him. "I am not for sale," she said, her voice steady, and Ethan nodded immediately. "I know," he replied, and there was no hesitation, no correction, just agreement. And that, more than anything, seemed to matter. And Lily studied him for another second, then slipped the card back into her pocket, not returning it, not accepting it fully, just keeping it. And she said, "I will think about it." And Ethan inclined his head slightly, not pushing, not pressing. "That is all I am asking," he said, and the city moved around them, steady, indifferent. But something had shifted in that quiet exchange, something that neither of them fully named, but both of them felt. And as Lily turned to leave, taking a few steps down the sidewalk, Ethan remained where he was, watching her go, not with control, not with certainty, but with something far more unfamiliar. Interest that had no clear outcome, and for the first time in a long time, he did not try to predict what would happen next. The city did not slow down for anyone, and yet for Lily Harper, the walk home felt quieter than usual, each step measured against the thoughts she had not planned to carry, the card in her pocket resting like a question she had not yet answered, and she kept her gaze forward, passing storefronts already dimmed for the night, the reflections of streetlights stretching across glass and pavement, and she told herself what she had always told herself, that moments like this were temporary, that people like Ethan Caldwell existed in a different world, a world she had learned to observe but never enter. And still, something about the way he had listened lingered, not the offer, not the money, but the absence of assumption, and that was harder to dismiss. And the next morning arrived with the same quiet rhythm her life always followed, sunlight filtering through thin curtains, the faint hum of the city waking up, and Lily sat at a small kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands, her eyes not on the window, not on the clock, but on the business card now placed carefully in front of her. And she had not taken it out the night before, not immediately, but eventually she had, setting it down as if giving the question a physical form. And now it sat there, simple, minimal, a name, a number, nothing more, and yet it carried weight far beyond its design. And she reached out, her fingers brushing its edge, not picking it up, just acknowledging it again. And then she leaned back slightly, exhaling, her mind moving not through the conversation, but through what it represented: possibility, risk, change, and all the things she had spent years keeping at a distance. And across the city, in a glass office high above the streets, Ethan Caldwell stood by a window that overlooked everything and nothing at the same time. The skyline stretching endlessly, the movement below reduced to patterns and motion, and his desk behind him was already covered in reports, updates, messages waiting for his attention. but he had not touched any of them yet, because for the first time in a long time, his focus was not on what he could control, but on what he could not predict. And he turned slightly, picking up his phone, not to check emails, not to review numbers, but to open a blank message. And for a moment, he simply stared at the screen, as if the act of reaching out required a different kind of calculation. And then he typed a single line, simple, direct, without strategy, without framing. And he paused before sending it, not because he doubted the words, but because he recognized that this was not a negotiation, not a move in a larger plan, just a conversation, and that made it unfamiliar. And then he sent it, and set the phone down without waiting for a response, returning to the window as if giving the moment space to exist on its own. And back in her apartment, Lily's phone vibrated softly against the table, breaking the stillness, and she glanced at it, not immediately reaching, just noticing. And then she picked it up, her eyes scanning the message quickly, and it read, "No pressure. Just coffee. 10 minutes. Your terms." And she held the phone for a second longer, her expression unreadable, and then she set it back down beside the card, not responding, not dismissing, just letting it sit. And the hours passed, the day moving forward with its usual demands, her shift beginning again, the familiar environment grounding her in routine, orders, conversations, the steady flow of work that left little room for distraction. And yet the thought remained, not intrusive, not overwhelming, just present, like a quiet note in the background of everything else. And by late afternoon, as the light outside began to soften, Lily stepped away briefly, standing near the back entrance of the restaurant, the same door she had walked through the night before, and she reached into her pocket, pulling out the card again, turning it once between her fingers, and for a moment she closed her eyes, not in hesitation, but in clarity, as if aligning something within herself. And then she opened them, taking a slow breath before pulling out her phone, her thumb hovering for a second before she typed, 10 minutes. Not for the job. And she paused, reading it once, and then she sent it, slipping the phone back into her pocket as if the decision had already settled. And across the city, Ethan's phone lit up on his desk, the message appearing in quiet contrast to the noise of everything else demanding his attention. And when he read it, there was no smile, no visible reaction, just a small shift in his posture, a subtle exhale. And he picked up his jacket, already moving, not because he needed to, but because for the first time in a long time, he wanted to. The cafe was smaller than the places Ethan Caldwell was used to, the kind of place people walked past without noticing, tucked between a bookstore and a laundromat, its windows slightly fogged from the warmth inside. And when he stepped through the door, the quiet contrast was immediate. No polished marble, no hushed conversations about million-dollar deals, just the soft hum of a coffee machine and the low murmur of ordinary life. And he paused for a second, adjusting not his suit, not his posture, but his expectations. And then he saw her, Lily Harper, already seated at a small table near the window, a simple cup of coffee in front of her, untouched, her posture relaxed but attentive, as if she had arrived not early, not late, but exactly when she intended to. And he walked over, his steps steady, unhurried, and when he reached the table, she looked up, meeting his gaze with the same calm presence he had come to recognize, and he gave a slight nod. "You chose the place," he said, his voice carrying a note of quiet curiosity, and Lily glanced around briefly, then back at him. "It is quiet," she replied, and he pulled out the chair across from her, sitting down without hesitation, without asking, not out of assumption, but because the invitation had already been given. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the kind of silence that did not need to be filled. And then Ethan leaned back slightly, his hands resting loosely on the table. 10 minutes, he said, a faint echo of her earlier condition, and Lily nodded once. 10 minutes, she confirmed. And there was something almost understatedly humorous in the way they mirrored each other, not intentionally, but naturally. And Ethan allowed a small smile to form, brief but real, before it faded into something more thoughtful. And he said, "I meant what I said last night," his tone steady, "about the work." And Lily's gaze did not shift, did not soften. It remained exactly as it was, clear, composed. "I know," she said, and he studied her for a moment, noting the absence of surprise, the absence of eagerness, the absence of anything that suggested she had been waiting for this conversation, and that, more than anything, made him choose his next words carefully. But this is not about filling a position, he continued. It is about changing how I make decisions. And Lily's brow lifted just slightly, not in skepticism, but in interest, and she asked, because of one contract, and Ethan shook his head. Because of what that contract revealed, he replied. Not about them, but about me. And the honesty in that statement shifted the tone again, subtle, but undeniable, and Lily leaned back slightly, her fingers wrapping loosely around her cup. Not drinking, just holding it. Most people do not admit that, she said, and Ethan gave a small shrug. Most people do not have the luxury of ignoring it, he answered, and for a second, there was something almost lighter in the air, not humor exactly, but a shared understanding that did not need explanation, and Lily's lips curved faintly. That sounds like something someone with your level of control would say, she replied, and Ethan let out a quiet breath that could have been a laugh. Control is only useful when it is accurate, he said. Last night, it was not. And Lily studied him for a moment longer, her expression thoughtful, as if weighing not his words, but the intention behind them, and then she asked, so what happens if I disagree with you? And Ethan did not hesitate. Then I listen, he said, and Lily's gaze sharpened slightly, not confrontational, but precise. And if you still think you are right, she pressed, and Ethan leaned forward just a fraction, his voice lower now, more deliberate. Then I ask why you do not, he replied, and the simplicity of that answer lingered between them, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just clear, and Lily looked down at her cup for a brief second, her thumb tracing the rim unconsciously, and then she looked back up. That is not how most people in your position operate, she said, and Ethan nodded. I am starting to realize that is the problem, he replied, and for the first time, there was no distance in the conversation, no roles to maintain, just two people speaking plainly, and the cafe continued around them, unnoticed, the quiet background to something that felt more significant than its setting suggested, and after a moment, Lily set her cup down gently, her hands returning to rest on the table, and she said, I am not interested in being part of your system. Her voice calm, but firm, and Ethan did not react defensively, did not counter, he simply nodded once. I did not think you would be, he said, and that acknowledgement landed softly, but firmly, and Lily tilted her head slightly. Then why are we here? She asked, and Ethan met her gaze, steady, unguarded. Because I want to understand how you think, he said, without trying to own it. And the words settled into the space between them, quiet, deliberate, and for a moment, Lily said nothing, her eyes holding his, searching, not for flaws, not for contradictions, but for something deeper, something consistent, and whatever she found, it did not make her pull away, and instead, she gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and said, then ask, and Ethan leaned back slightly, not rushing, not overwhelming the moment, just present, and for the first time. The conversation was not about a deal, not about a contract, not about an offer, but about something far less tangible and far more difficult to define, and neither of them seemed in a hurry to leave. The 10 minutes passed without either of them noticing exactly when they ended, the coffee between them cooling slowly, untouched, as the conversation moved in quiet layers rather than sharp turns, and Ethan Caldwell found himself asking questions he had not prepared, questions that did not belong to strategy or control, but to understanding, and Lily Harper answered in the same way she always had, not to impress, not to persuade, but simply to be accurate, and at some point the noise of the cafe faded into something distant, not because it had changed, but because their attention had narrowed, focused, and when Ethan finally glanced at his watch, the movement almost surprised him, as if time had behaved differently without his permission, and he looked back at her, a faint shift in his expression. That was more than 10 minutes, he said, and Lily's lips curved slightly, a quiet acknowledgement rather than an apology. You stayed, she replied, and he nodded once. So did you. And there was a pause, not empty, but full of something unspoken, something that did not need to be named to be understood, and outside the window, the light had softened further, the day moving toward evening, and Lily glanced toward it briefly before returning her gaze to him. And for the first time, there was a subtle change in her posture, not guarded, not distant, just more open, as if the space between them had shifted from unfamiliar to something almost comfortable, and Ethan noticed it, not consciously, but in the way his own shoulders relaxed slightly, the way his voice lost the last trace of formality. "I am not going to offer you the job again," he said. And Lily raised an eyebrow just slightly, not surprised, but curious. "Why not?" she asked. And Ethan leaned back, considering the answer for a moment before speaking. "Because I think you would say no," he said. "And I think I would try to convince you otherwise." And Lily's expression softened just enough to suggest she understood exactly what he meant. "And that would defeat the point," she added quietly, and Ethan nodded. "Exactly." And there was something almost light in the exchange, not humor in the usual sense, but a shared recognition of how things might have gone differently, and how they had not. And Lily reached for her cup then, taking a small sip, finally, as if marking a transition, and she set it back down with the same careful precision she carried into everything she did. "So what happens now?" she asked. And the question was simple, but it carried more weight than it appeared, and Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because for once, he was not trying to define the outcome before it arrived. And when he did speak, his voice was steady, but quieter. "Now we keep talking," he said, and Lily studied him for a moment, not evaluating the words, but the intention behind them, and whatever she found there, it did not make her step back, and instead, she gave a small nod, almost imperceptible. "On equal terms," she said, and Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "On equal terms," he repeated, and the agreement settled between them without formality, without conditions, just understood, and they both stood then, almost at the same time, not coordinated, but aligned. And as they stepped out of the cafe, the evening air greeted them with a soft coolness, the city lights beginning to glow against the fading sky. And for a moment they stood side by side, not moving, not rushing, just present, and Ethan glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "You changed something yesterday," he said, and Lily looked ahead, her gaze steady. "So did you," she replied, and he let out a quiet breath, something between a laugh and an acknowledgement. "I offered you $10 million as a joke," he said, "and you gave me something I could not buy." And Lily turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes, her expression calm, but there was a warmth there now, subtle, but real. "You learned to listen," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more meaning than any elaborate explanation could have. And for a second neither of them looked away, the space between them no longer defined by distance or difference, but by something quieter, something steadier, and Ethan shifted slightly, not stepping closer, not crossing any line, but no longer holding himself apart either. And he said, "Would you like to walk?" And Lily considered the question for a brief moment, not because she needed to, but because she chose to, and then she nodded once. "Yes," she said, and they began to move together down the sidewalk, not in a hurry, not toward any defined destination, just forward, side by side. And the city continued around them, unchanged, indifferent, but something within that quiet moment had shifted in a way neither of them needed to name, because it was already understood. And as they walked, the distance between who they had been at the beginning of that first conversation and who they were now faded into something almost unrecognizable, and neither of them tried to return to it. And in the soft rhythm of their steps, there was no transaction, no performance, no expectation, just two people who had met in a moment of imbalance and chosen, quietly, to meet again on equal ground. And that, more than anything, was where everything began. If this story touched your heart, do not forget to like, share the video, and share with us where you are watching from, and subscribe to When He Chose Her channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful, emotional stories to life. Stay with us for more moments where quiet strength changes everything.